Cold-blooded bikers laugh at a poor farmer. Seconds later, they're running for cover. The wind howled through the open countryside, rattling the branches of the few lone trees scattered across the desolate stretch of land. A storm was rolling in, the sky overhead a swirling mix of dark blues and grays, thunder rumbling low and deep like a distant war drum. The road was nothing more than a strip of dry dirt, cracked from the sun, twisting through the fields like a scar. Along it, a group of bikers thundered through, their engines roaring against the wind. Leather jackets, dark helmets, and chrome machines gleamed under the flashes of lightning in the distance. There were 7 of them, moving as a pack, their leader, a burly man with a scar down his cheek, riding at the front, a smirk tugging at his lips. The others followed close behind, each of them laughing and hollering as they tore through the countryside, kicking up dust in their wake. They were looking for trouble, the kind of men who got bored easily and enjoyed watching people squirm. Then they saw him. Up ahead, trudging along the side of the road, was an old man, his clothes ragged and stained with dirt. He had a bent straw hat pulled low over his face, shielding himself from the sharp gusts of wind. His cart, a rickety wooden thing with iron wheels, was piled high with what looked like sacks of grain and a few rusted tools, all barely held together by a single frayed rope. The wheels creaked with each slow step he took. One of the bikers whistled. "Would you look at that?" Their leader, Mitch, grinned. "Looks like someone's still living in the Stone Age." The group erupted into laughter as they slowed their bikes, circling the old man like a pack of wolves sizing up their prey. The old man didn't react. He just kept walking forward, slow and steady, like he didn't have a care in the world. Mitch pulled up alongside him, letting his engine growl loudly, but still, the old man didn't flinch. "Well now," Mitch said, smirking. "Ain't this a sight? Old-timer, what are you doing out here all alone?" The old man didn't stop walking. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Same thing I do every day, son. Work in my land." One of the bikers behind Mitch snorted. "Your land? You mean this dust pile?" Mitch chuckled, looking around at the barren fields stretching out around them. "I hate to break it to you, Grandpa, but I don't see no farm." The old man still didn't look up. He adjusted the grip on his cart, the wooden frame creaking under his touch. "Just 'cause you don't see it," the old man said, "don't mean it ain't there." That made the bikers laugh even harder. "Oh ho, we got ourselves a wise guy," one of them cackled. Mitch licked his lips, amused. He enjoyed these little moments, the feeling of power, the rush of being in control. "You know what?" he said, sliding off his bike. "I think a man like you oughta pay a toll for walking on our road." The old man stopped. Finally, he lifted his head just enough for Mitch to see his eyes. They were dark, unreadable, holding something Mitch couldn't quite place. A slow grin spread across the old man's face. "I think you boys might want to keep moving." The wind howled louder. The sky above them rumbled again, a deep, vibrating sound that made the hairs on Mitch's arms stand up. One of the bikers behind him frowned, shifting in his seat. "Boss, maybe we should?" Mitch held up a hand. "Relax. It's just a storm." He turned back to the old man, eyes narrowing. "You talk big for a guy with a busted-up cart and a bunch of old wheat." The old man chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Ain't my talkin' you should be worried about." Mitch's smirk faltered for just a second. The wind kicked up harder, and something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped. One of the bikers shivered, rubbing his arms. "The hell? It was warm a second ago." "Shut up," Mitch muttered, but even he felt it. There was something wrong. The old man turned away and kept walking, as if they weren't even there. That pissed Mitch off. "Where do you think you're going, old man?" Mitch reached out, grabbing the old man's shoulder. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, crack, a bolt of lightning slammed into the field beside them, so close that the air itself seemed to burn. The bikers jumped, a few of them stumbling back, clutching their chests. Mitch jerked his hand away like he had just touched a hot stove. The old man didn't even flinch. Instead, he simply turned his head, that same eerie grin still stretching across his face. "Storm's getting close," he said softly. "You should go." Mitch's heart pounded in his chest. The ground beneath them rumbled slightly, the wind whipping dust into the air. One of the bikers cursed under his breath. "Boss, let's go, man. This don't feel right." But Mitch wasn't done. He forced himself to laugh, shaking off the unease. "You boys scared of a little thunder?" he sneered. He bent down, grabbed the old man's straw hat off his head, and tossed it into the mud. The other bikers hesitated. For the first time, no one laughed. Mitch grinned. "Let's see you smile now, old-timer." The old man didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't react at all. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward Mitch, and for the first time, the amusement was gone. Mitch felt a chill run down his spine. The wind died. The silence was deafening. The biker who had picked up the old man's hat suddenly let out a strangled cry. Mitch spun around just in time to see the man drop the hat like it was burning his skin. His hands were red, blistered, like he had touched something boiling. What the? Before Mitch could process it, the motorcycles behind them sputtered and died. Engines cutting off all at once. The men cursed, trying to restart them, but nothing happened. The air was too still. The storm above them didn't move. It was as if time itself had stopped. Mitch turned back to the old man. His heart hammered in his chest. The old man just smiled. "You should have kept riding." The sky opened up. A wall of rain slammed down so hard, it felt like a flood had dropped from the heavens. The road beneath them turned to mud instantly. Lightning lit up the sky in jagged lines, striking closer and closer. And then, the screaming started. The screams were drowned out by the roaring storm, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something acrid, metallic, almost electric. The rain slammed down in sheets, soaking the ground in an instant, turning the once dry dirt road into a thick, sucking mess of mud. Mitch wiped at his face, blinking hard, trying to see through the downpour. His heart pounded, breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he spun around. His men were struggling, slipping in the mud, scrambling to their feet. One of them, Kyle, was clawing at his arms, eyes wide with panic. My hands, man, they're burning." Mitch grabbed Kyle's wrist, lifting it toward the weak light of the storm. His skin was red, raw, as if it had been scalded, the flesh looking almost wrong. Mitch's stomach twisted. What the hell is happening? A flash of lightning illuminated the road for just a split second, but it was enough to send his blood running cold. The bikes were gone. Not moved. Not tipped over. Gone. Just empty space where they had been. Mitch's breath caught. He spun toward the others, his throat tight, but no one spoke. They all saw it. No sound of engines, no tracks leading away, just 7 empty spaces in the mud where their bikes should have been. One of the younger guys, Danny, turned in a slow, jerky motion. His face was pale beneath the wet strands of hair stuck to his forehead. "Boss," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind, "we need to go." Now, Mitch's mind raced. This was some kind of trick. Had to be. Someone must have been watching them, waiting, pulling some sick joke. Maybe some hillbilly freaks hiding in the woods. But the woods were silent. Too silent. He turned back to the old man, but he was gone. Just like the bikes. Mitch's stomach knotted. The rain lashed at his face, blurring his vision. He spun, searching, but the road stretched out empty in both directions, just the flickering light of the storm crackling in the sky. One of the bikers, Reggie, stumbled forward, his voice shaking. Where'd he go? Where the hell did he go? No one answered. Then a whisper. So, almost lost in the storm. But Mitch heard it. A voice. A deep, raspy breath against the back of his neck. "You should have kept riding." Mitch spun around so fast he nearly slipped in the mud. His eyes darted wildly, his breath sharp and ragged. Nothing. Just darkness. Just rain. He could feel his pulse hammering against his ribs, his hands curling into fists. His leather jacket was soaked through, the cold biting into his skin. This wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. Then Danny let out a strangled cry. Mitch turned just in time to see him drop to his knees, clutching his head, his fingers tangled in his soaked hair. His mouth moved, gasping, whispering something under his breath. Mitch grabbed his collar, shaking him hard. What are you saying? Danny's lips trembled. I see them, he choked out. Mitch's chest tightened. See what? Danny's eyes lifted, locking onto his, wide and glass-like, like he was staring through Mitch, not at him. The bikes, he whispered. His voice sounded wrong. Like it wasn't his voice at all. Mitch's grip tightened. Where? Danny pointed. And Mitch turned. The lightning flashed again. And for just a second, just long enough for his brain to register, he saw them. The bikes were there. At the end of the road. But they weren't normal. They stood upright, engines dead, yet somehow shaking, vibrating like they were caught between two realities. The chrome was rusted over, warped and twisted into shapes that didn't make sense. The headlights flickered on and off, not steady, but like something inside was breathing. And behind them, Mitch blinked. No, that wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Figures stood behind the bikes. Wrong. Their limbs were too long. Their shadows stretched too far. They weren't people. And they were watching. Mitch's breath hitched in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, to move, to do something, anything, but his body wouldn't listen. The figures began to shift. Slow, gliding movements. Closer, closer, Danny shrieked. Mitch snapped out of it. Move. The bikers scattered. They ran. Through the mud. Through the rain. Away from the road. Mitch didn't care where they were going, as long as it was away. His feet slipped, his boots sinking into the wet earth, but he pushed forward, forcing himself to keep going even as the wind clawed at him like invisible hands. One of the bikers, Cole, fell hard, face slamming into the dirt. Mitch didn't stop. He couldn't. Cole's scream was swallowed by the storm. Mitch didn't look back. Something grabbed his jacket. Cold. Ice cold. His skin prickled. He turned eyes wide. Then his face pale, his eyes still glassy, unfocused. Mitch shook him violently. Snap out of it. Danny's lips parted. His voice was barely a whisper. They're calling us. Mitch felt his stomach drop. No, he hissed. No one is calling us. Danny smiled. And then his mouth stretched too wide. Too wide. Mitch shoved him away with a strangled curse. Danny's head tilted slightly, his wet hair sticking to his cheeks. He took a step back. And was gone. Not into the storm. Not into the trees. Just gone. Like he had never been there. Mitch stood frozen, chest rising and falling in sharp, heaving gasps. Then he heard it. Not the wind. Not the thunder. Not even the rain. Laughter. So chilling. All around him. Mitch's breath hitched. And then, in the flicker of the next lightning strike, he saw them again. Closer. The figures behind the bikes. Only now, they weren't behind the bikes anymore. They were wearing them. And the engines, they roared to life. Mitch ran. Mitch ran harder than he ever had in his life, his boots slamming into the mud, the weight of the rain dragging him down. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his lungs burning. The laughter didn't stop. It twisted through the storm, seeping into his bones, rattling in his skull. Behind him, the bikes roared, but it wasn't the sound of normal engines. It was warped, like metal grinding against bone, like something alive trying to break free. Mitch forced himself forward, lungs screaming, muscles aching. He had to get away. Had to make it out. The storm raged on, the wind slamming into him, knocking him sideways. He barely caught himself before his body hit the mud. He could feel something watching him. Eyes that weren't there, hands reaching through the dark, fingers curling around the edges of reality itself. And then, a biker screamed. Mitch whirled around, skidding to a stop. It was Reggie. He was a few feet behind him, his body stiff, his arms raised in front of his face as if trying to shield himself. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His mouth was open in a silent gasp of horror. Mitch felt his stomach twist. Reggie wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. And then slowly, so slowly, he started to lift. Not by his own power. By something else. Mitch staggered backward, watching, helpless, as Reggie's boots lifted off the ground, his arms trembling, his fingers twitching. And then, his head snapped back violently. Mitch flinched, choking back bile. Something was pulling him up. Something they couldn't see. Reggie's body shuddered, his limbs twisting unnaturally. He was suspended in the air, his mouth still open, but there was no scream. No sound at all. Then, without warning, he was gone. Like he'd been snatched out of existence. 1 second he was there. The next, nothing. Mitch stumbled back, his entire body shaking. Reggie? No response. Nothing but rain. The ground where Reggie had been was untouched. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Just emptiness. Mitch's heart slammed against his ribs. A shadow moved in the distance. Mitch's breath hitched. The bikes were moving. Slow at first, rolling forward through the mud. But there was no one riding them. No one human, anyway. The headlights flickered, beams of light cutting through the storm, illuminating figures that weren't supposed to be there. Figures with 2 long limbs, faces hidden in shadow, shapes shifting and twisting with every flicker of the storm's light. One of them turned toward Mitch. It had no eyes. Just dark hollows where they should have been. And yet, Mitch felt it looking at him. His legs refused to move. A biker beside him sobbed, dropping to his knees. "Please," the man choked out. "Please, I don't want to die." The laughter stopped. Everything went silent. Even the wind. The rain still fell, but there was no sound. Like the world itself had been muted. Mitch's chest tightened. He reached for the biker, grabbing his jacket, trying to pull him up. "We have to go." The biker was shaking violently. His hands dug into the mud, his nails clawing at the earth. He lifted his head. Mitch's breath caught. The biker's eyes were gone. Just black voids, gaping and endless. His lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. And then, he vanished. Gone. Just like Reggie. Mitch staggered back, his hands covered in mud, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What was this? What the hell was happening? The bikes roared louder. And then, finally, the figures moved. They didn't walk. They didn't run. They glided across the mud, their limbs twisting, bending at unnatural angles. Mitch turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going. Didn't care. He just knew he had to get away. The storm twisted around him, the rain blinding, the ground shifting beneath his feet like it was alive. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to give out. And then, he saw it. A house, barely visible through the storm. An old farmhouse, dark and silent, standing at the edge of the fields. Mitch didn't stop to think. He ran toward it, staggering, slipping, forcing himself forward. The bikes were right behind him now, engines roaring, headlights cutting through the storm. The figures. He could hear them whispering, calling his name. Mitch reached the front steps, practically throwing himself against the wooden door. He grabbed the handle, twisted. It was unlocked. He shoved it open, stumbling inside, slamming it shut behind him. For a moment, just a moment, everything went still. Mitch pressed his back against the door, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His heart was pounding so hard it hurt. His jacket was soaked through, his hands trembling. The room was dark, empty, silent. He took a slow step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. Another step. Then another. A single light bulb flickered in the center of the ceiling, casting long, stretched shadows. Mitch swallowed hard. His pulse thundered in his ears. He turned his head, scanning the room. Dust-covered furniture. Old cabinets. A table with a single, untouched plate resting on it. But something was wrong. Used. Like someone had been there just seconds before. His eyes darted toward the walls. His breath caught in his throat. There were pictures hanging on them. Old photographs, sepia-toned, the edges curling with age. His gaze moved across them, his stomach twisting. At first, they seemed normal. Farmers. Families. Smiling faces. But then, his chest tightened. One of the photos. A group of men stood together, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Men wearing leather jackets. Men who looked just like him. And at the center of the photo, a man with a scar down his cheek. Mitch's breath shook. That was him. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't right. The door behind him creaked open. Mitch froze. A shadow stretched across the wooden floor. Slow. Deliberate. A voice. Familiar. You should have kept riding. Mitch turned and saw him. The farmer. Standing in the doorway. Smiling. The light bulb above them flickered once. And then everything went black. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Mitch couldn't see, couldn't even hear his own breath. For a moment, it was like he didn't exist at all. Then, the lights flickered back on. Dim, unsteady. The farmer still stood in the doorway, his smile never fading, his face half-shadowed by the storm raging outside. The wind howled, rattling the wooden walls, but inside, the house was still. Mitch's pulse pounded against his skull. What? His voice barely worked. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. What the hell is going on? The farmer tilted his head slightly. The movement was too slow, too calculated, as if he were deciding how much to say. You're asking the wrong question, son. Mitch's breathing hitched. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. You did something, he snapped, voice shaking with both rage and fear. I don't know what, but you... The farmer stepped forward. Just one step. But the floor didn't creak beneath his weight. The sound of the storm outside dimmed, like the world itself was shrinking. Mitch stiffened. The farmer shouldn't be here. He shouldn't exist. Mitch's chest tightened. Something felt wrong. Then his eyes drifted back to the photographs on the wall. To the one with his face in it. His gut twisted. That picture. His voice was barely above a whisper. That's me. The farmer's grin widened. Just a little. Yeah, he said softly. It is. Mitch's knees nearly buckled. His mouth went dry. No, he shook his head violently. No, that's not possible. That picture's, what, 50 years old? I wasn't even. The farmer took another step. Mitch felt his body lock up. That same feeling again. That sensation of being watched from all angles. Trapped. You ever heard of the Crossroads, son? Mitch's breath hitched. A flash of something familiar shot through his mind, like a memory just out of reach. The Devil's Crossroads. It was an old legend, some backwoods tale about a place where men made deals. Deals for power, for fortune, for escape. But all of them ended the same way. But Mitch took a step back, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. You're messing with my head, he growled. That's all this is. Some backwoods freak show. The farmer chuckled. I didn't mess with nothing, boy. You did. Mitch's breath came faster now. His skin felt too tight, too hot. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. The lights flickered again. The shadows on the walls shifted, stretching like they were alive. Mitch's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Where are my men? The farmer's grin didn't change. They never left. Mitch's stomach dropped. A loud crack split the air outside, thunder shaking the walls, making the entire house shudder like it was breathing. The lights flickered one last time. And then, they went out. Total blackness. Mitch felt something move. Not in front of him. Behind him. Right behind him. He spun. Too slow. A hand gripped his wrist. Cold. Ice cold. A voice. But not from the farmer. A whisper. A voice Mitch knew. Boss? Mitch's blood turned to ice. He yanked his arm back, stumbling away. The lights flashed back on for just a second. And in that second, Mitch saw Reggie. Or what was left of him. He was standing there, just feet away. His leather jacket soaked, his face pale, too pale. His eyes were hollow, black pits, staring straight through Mitch. And then, he smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. Mitch felt his stomach twist. No, he whispered. Reggie tilted his head. His mouth moved, but the words weren't his own. Should have kept riding, boss. Mitch ran. He didn't think. Didn't look. Didn't care that his body screamed in protest. He just ran. Through the kitchen, past broken chairs and warped cabinets, toward the back door. He slammed into it, shoving it open, bursting outside into the storm. The wind was a living thing, clawing at him, ripping through his clothes. Mitch staggered into the field, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He kept running. And then he saw them. All of them. His crew. Standing in a row. Perfectly still. Facing him. Their faces. Wrong. Not twisted in fear. Not frozen in agony. Smiling. Not a single one of them blinked. Then he cut. All of them. Waiting. Mitch's lungs burned. His hands shook. He tried to speak. Tried to say something. Anything. But his voice wouldn't come. The storm raged around them, lightning flashing across the sky. The bikes rumbled to life. Mitch's stomach dropped. The engines roared, shaking the ground beneath him. And one by one, the bikers swung their legs over their seats. They weren't walking. They weren't thinking. They were moving like puppets on strings. Mitch's pulse slammed in his ears. No, he whispered. One of them turned his head. The smile never left his face. Time to ride, boss. Mitch stumbled back. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. The farmer's voice again. Amused. Looks like your boys found their road after all. Mitch turned. The farmer stood at the edge of the field. Watching. Waiting. Mitch's hands curled into fists. What did you do to them? He shouted. The farmer just shrugged. Didn't do nothing. They made their deal. Mitch's head spun. No, this was a lie. The trick. But deep down, something inside him whispered the truth. They'd been here before. They'd all been here before. And every time, it ended just like this. Mitch staggered backward, the wind screaming in his ears. His men, or whatever they were now, revved their engines. One by one, Mitch's breath came in shaky gasps. He could see it now. The pattern. The cycle. The deal they'd made. A road with no end. A ride that never stopped. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a storm. This wasn't just bad luck. This was their fate. The farmer tilted his head. Time to choose, son. Mitch turned back toward his men. They were waiting. Engines rumbling. Smiling. Calling him home. Mitch's breath came in ragged gasps. His soaked clothes clung to his skin, the cold gnawing at him, but it was nothing compared to the ice creeping into his bones. His men sat astride their bikes, engines rumbling like growling beasts, their smiles frozen, unnatural. The storm raged around them, lightning streaking the sky, but they didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move like men anymore. Mitch staggered back, his boots sinking into the wet earth. His pulse slammed against his ribs, his mind screaming at him to run, to wake up, to undo whatever this was. But there was no waking up from this. The farmer's voice, calm and patient, cut through the thunder. Ain't no use running, son. You already made your choice. Mitch whirled around, fury snapping through his fear. I didn't make a damn choice, he snarled, the panic making his voice raw. The farmer just chuckled. Didn't you? Mitch's breathing hitched. He felt it again, the weight of something unspoken. Something old. The memory hit like a freight train. He saw himself, younger, reckless, desperate. He saw his crew around him, just like they were now, their laughter thick with the false confidence of men who thought they'd live forever. He saw himself standing at the very same crossroads, the very same road, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, making jokes about never slowing down, never stopping. And the farmer, or someone who looked just like him, had been there. They had all laughed, thinking it was just another game. Another story. A deal for one last ride. One that would never end. Mitch's stomach twisted. No, that wasn't real. That had been some drunken night, a foggy memory at best. A joke. But the laughter echoed in his ears now, the laughter of his crew, and his own voice whispering. We don't stop riding, boys. We never stop. Mitch's vision blurred. His body swayed. His crew had never left this place. They had been riding this road forever. And it was his fault. His knees nearly buckled. The farmer stepped closer, eyes gleaming in the dim light. You made your deal, son. You rode the road. But every road's got an end. Mitch's chest heaved. He turned back to his men, still waiting, still smiling, their hands gripping their handlebars like they were ready to go. One of them, Kyle, tilted his head. Come on, boss, he said, his voice raw, layered with something else beneath it. Something ancient. Time to ride. Mitch shook his head violently. "No," he rasped. "Not this time. I'm not." A powerful gust of wind slammed into him. And suddenly, he was back on his bike. He didn't remember moving, didn't remember climbing on. But his hands were on the grips. His boots rested on the pegs. The engine beneath him hummed, thrumming with something more than just power. Something hungry. His men turned toward him, one by one, grinning. The farmer stood behind them all, tipping his hat. "Every man gets a choice," he said. "Even if he don't remember making it." Mitch's body locked up. The bike pulled forward, not from his own doing. It was moving on its own. The others followed suit, their headlights flickering like dying stars. The road ahead stretched into eternity, dark and endless, the storm swirling like an open mouth, ready to swallow them whole. Mitch tried to wrench himself free, to jump off, to scream, but the bike didn't let him go. Neither did the road. His crew flanked him, riding in formation, their laughter twisting through the wind. The farmer's voice, soft and final. "Ride hard, son. Ride forever." The world shook. The storm closed in. And Mitch knew nothing else. Only the road beneath him, the engine roaring, and the ride that never ended. Mitch could feel it now, the road pulling him in, dragging him forward like an unseen force had wrapped its fingers around his spine. The bike beneath him shuddered, vibrating with something more than just mechanical power. It felt alive, like a beast thrumming with hunger, waiting to take him somewhere he was never meant to return from. His hands gripped the handlebars against his will. His fingers refused to let go. His men flanked him on either side, their smiles frozen, their eyes gleaming with something unnatural. They didn't speak anymore. They didn't have to. They had accepted it. Mitch's stomach twisted. His mind screamed for him to stop, to fight back, to rip himself free. But the bike moved on its own. The road stretched ahead, long and dark, a ribbon of pure blackness cutting through a storm that no longer seemed bound by the laws of nature. The sky churned, swirling like an open mouth, waiting. The thunder rumbled deep, not just above them, but inside them, like something ancient was calling them home. Mitch tried to turn his head, tried to look back, but the moment he did, he felt it. A weight. Heavy. Crushing. He wasn't allowed to look back. No one ever did. Something deep inside him cracked. He had been here before. He had always been here. Riding. Running. Forgetting. Mitch gritted his teeth, fighting against the growing fog in his head, the sensation that he was losing pieces of himself. His name. His past. His pain. It was fading. His crew rode beside him, their bodies stiff, their jackets soaked in rain that somehow never dried. Their bikes thrummed like beating hearts. He could hear them breathing. Not his men. The bikes. Mitch's pulse slammed against his ribs. He had to get off. Had to break free. Had to end this. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Mitch wrenched his hand away from the throttle, his fingers tearing away like they had been fused to the metal. Pain exploded through his palm, but he didn't care. He reached for his leg, for his belt, his knife, the blade he had carried for years, the only thing that had ever felt real. Mitch gripped the handle, his breath ragged, and with one final surge of strength, he jammed it into the bike's fuel tank. The world exploded. Fire. Screaming metal. For the first time, the storm reacted. The road shattered like glass beneath him, cracking apart, revealing a void so deep, so endless, it swallowed the sound, the light, the storm itself. Mitch felt himself torn from the bike, his body weightless, spinning, falling, 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 falling. Then, silence. For the first time in what felt like centuries, there was nothing. No storm, no bikes, no wind, no road. Mitch opened his eyes. He was lying on his back. The rain was gone. The sky was clear, the moon full and round above him. For a long moment he just breathed. His body ached. His lungs burned. But he was alive. Slowly, painfully he sat up. The road stretched behind him, empty. No tire tracks. No smoke. No sign that the others had ever been there. Mitch's hands shook. He turned, eyes scanning the land. And there, standing a few feet away, was the farmer. His straw hat was back on his head, his expression unreadable. Mitch staggered to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He opened his mouth, demanding, accusing, cursing, but no words came. The farmer tipped his hat. "You figured it out," he said, his voice almost approving. Mitch's heart pounded. He felt something in his hand. He looked down. The knife. The blade was blackened, covered in something thicker than just fuel. Something older. Mitch swallowed hard. The farmer nodded toward the road. "Ain't many do, you know," he said. "Most keep ridin'. Keep forgettin'." Mitch's fingers tightened around the knife handle. "I want my men back." The farmer's lips twitched, just a hint of a smirk. "Don't work like that, son." Mitch's jaw clenched. His body shook with something between rage and exhaustion. "They didn't know," he whispered. "They didn't know what they were agreeing to." The farmer exhaled slowly, shifting his weight. "That's the thing about choices," he said. "Don't always seem like choices when you make 'em." Mitch's stomach twisted. "You tricked us?" The farmer raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" Mitch's breath hitched. The memory came back, clear this time. That night. The deal. It hadn't been a trick. It had been him. He had laughed. Agreed. Made the promise. Mitch swallowed. His own voice echoed in his mind. "We don't stop riding, boys. We never stop." The farmer watched him, waiting. Mitch forced down the lump in his throat. He turned back to the road. It was still there. Waiting. But now it was different. It didn't pull at him anymore. It didn't own him. Mitch inhaled shakily. "So what now?" The farmer shrugged. "That's up to you." Mitch's fingers curled into a fist. His men were gone. His bike was gone. And yet, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Mitch felt free. He turned his back on the road. And he walked away. The wind whispered one last time, carrying the echoes of old laughter. And then silence. Forever. Mitch walked away from the road, his body sore, his mind reeling. The sky was clear now, the stars stretching endlessly above him, as if the storm had never happened. The wet mud beneath his boots was already drying, the air crisp and silent. The farmer had vanished, like he had never been there in the first place. He kept moving, step after step, his pulse still pounding. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't riding. He was free. Or at least, that's what he thought. As he walked, his surroundings began to shift. The road behind him disappeared into the horizon, swallowed by the night. The trees on either side grew taller, darker, stretching into the sky like jagged fingers. The air turned thicker, heavier, as if the world itself was slowing down. Mitch noticed it too late. When he finally stopped walking, his breath caught in his throat. He was back. Back at the same damn crossroads. The empty road stretched in front of him, just as before, twisting into the night, endless and hungry. His body went cold. No, that wasn't possible. He turned sharply, scanning his surroundings. The old rusted road sign stood exactly where it had been before, its wooden post barely holding up against time. Devil's Crossroads. Mitch's heart slammed against his ribs. He had walked straight back into it. But how? He had gone in a straight line. He hadn't turned. Hadn't looked back. A sound. So familiar. The sound of an engine starting. Mitch froze. His skin went tight, his breath sharp. Slowly, he turned his head. And his bike was there. Sitting perfectly upright on the side of the road. Chrome shining under the moonlight. Like it had been waiting for him. Mitch took a slow step back. Then another. His entire body screamed at him to run. But something kept him there. The air around him was too still. Like the world was holding its breath. A gust of wind kicked up, rattling the road sign. Mitch swallowed hard, his mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He had gotten off the road. Had broken free. He had escaped. Right? A sharp pain suddenly shot through his head, like something had stabbed straight into his skull. Mitch staggered, grabbing his temples as a wave of nausea hit him. A memory forced its way to the surface. Not his memory. Not his life. The sensation of riding. Endless, eternal. Wheels on pavement, rumbling beneath him, time slipping away like water through his fingers. He had been here before. Not just tonight. Not just this lifetime. Many times. And every time he had thought he was free, only to find himself right back where he started. The realization hit like a gut punch. This was the end of the road. And it always led right back here. His legs felt weak. His throat dry. A familiar voice whispered behind him. "You really thought you could leave, son?" Mitch's blood turned to ice. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. The farmer stood a few feet away, watching. Same straw hat. Same calm expression. Like he had never left. Like he had known Mitch would come back. Like he had been waiting for him. Mitch clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move, to run, to do something. But he couldn't. Because deep down he knew. The farmer sighed, shaking his head. "Ain't no escaping the deal, son." Mitch's jaw tightened. "I broke free." The farmer gave him a small, knowing smile. "You tried?" Mitch's breath hitched. He turned, forcing himself to look at the bike. It shouldn't be there. He had destroyed it. Had felt the fire consume it, take him down with it. And yet, there it was. Waiting. The farmer stepped closer, his voice lower now, almost pitying. "You always come back." Mitch's hands trembled. "Why?" The farmer tilted his head. "Because that's the ride you chose?" Mitch's stomach twisted. A fresh wave of memories flooded back. All the nights he had been on the road. The way time never seemed to catch up to him. The way he and his crew always seemed to be riding toward something, but never arriving. The way their bodies never aged. Never tired. Always riding. Always chasing. The truth slammed into him like a freight train. They had never been alive. Not since that night. Not since the deal. Mitch's breath came fast, ragged. He turned to the farmer, his chest heaving. "Then what happens now?" The farmer gave a small shrug. "Ain't up to me." Mitch's hands curled into fists. "Then who's it up to?" The farmer gestured to the bike. Mitch followed his gaze. The engine rumbled, purring like it was calling him home. His stomach turned. His own voice whispered in his head. "We don't stop riding, boys. We never stop." He had said it. He had sealed it. And now, the road was waiting. For him. For all of them. Mitch's vision blurred. His body moved on its own. One step. Then another. Then another. Before he even realized it, he was standing beside the bike. His hand reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the handlebar, everything snapped into place. His body felt lighter. The weight of questions, regrets, memories, gone. He swung his leg over the seat. It felt natural. Like he had never left. Like he had never tried to leave. The farmer tipped his hat. "See you down the road, son." Mitch revved the engine. It purred beneath him. His crew appeared beside him, grinning. Ready. Waiting. Danny smirked. "Took you long enough." Mitch felt a slow grin pull at his lips. He was home. He twisted the throttle. The bike roared. The road welcomed them back. And they rode into the night. Forever. The roar of the engine filled Mitch's ears, drowning out every other thought. The road stretched ahead, dark, endless, familiar. His fingers gripped the handlebars without hesitation. The wind howled past his face, sharp and cold, but it no longer stung. This was what he knew. This was who he was. And yet, something was different. There was a whisper in the back of his mind. A flicker of something he shouldn't remember. A voice, distant but insistent. "You've done this before." Mitch's fingers twitched. A sharp pulse ran through his skull, a flash of something just out of reach. He shook his head. No, he was just riding. That's what they did. That's what they always did. The others flanked him, engines rumbling like thunder, their faces set in stone. Their bodies moved perfectly in sync, but Mitch felt off. His chest tightened. His eyes flicked to his side, to Danny, riding just an inch away. The man's face was frozen in a smirk, the same damn smirk Mitch had seen 1,000 times. That was the problem. He had seen it before. Exactly like this. Every single detail. The way Danny's grip never loosened on the throttle. The way Reggie rode just a little too stiff. like a man holding onto a moment for eternity. Mitch's breath came faster. His pulse slammed in his ears. He knew this moment, knew the next turn before they reached it. He closed his eyes, and the memories slammed into him. Flashes, fragments, riding through centuries, through different bodies, different lifetimes, different roads, always coming back, always forgetting, until now. Mitch gasped, his body jerking forward like he had been yanked out of a dream. His grip faltered. His chest heaved. The others didn't notice, didn't react, because they weren't real. Not anymore. Not for a long, long time. Mitch clenched his teeth, his vision blurring. He wasn't just some echo on an endless road. He was real, and he was going to remember. Mitch forced his eyes shut, fighting against the weight of the cycle, the force that had kept him trapped, kept him blind. He reached, pulled. The world shattered. Mitch gasped as his eyes snapped open. He was standing, not on the bike, not on the road. He was in the middle of nothing, a space that was both everywhere and nowhere, a void stretching in all directions. The ground beneath him was solid but invisible. The air was still but heavy. He turned sharply, and there, watching him, was himself. Not just one version. Thousands. Hundreds of Mitches, standing in the distance, some older, some younger, some wearing different leather jackets, some with different scars, but all of them him. His stomach twisted. They weren't moving. They were frozen, locked in time, eyes blank. Mitch stumbled backward, his breath ragged. "What the hell is this?" His own voice whispered back, but not from his lips. "The road always takes you back." Mitch whirled around. A version of himself stood there, older, broken, his leather jacket torn, his face hollow and sunken. His eyes were tired, like a man who had seen lifetimes. Mitch's pulse spiked. No, his voice was sharp, desperate. "I broke free. I got off the road." The older version shook his head. "No, you just woke up." Mitch's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists. "This is a lie," he spat. "This isn't real." But deep down he knew. It was real. More real than anything. The road. The endless cycle. He had always been here. And the second he stopped believing, the second he stopped forgetting, the world had let him see. The other versions of himself didn't move, because they were still asleep. Mitch swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "How long have we been riding?" The older version smiled, but there was no joy in it. "You don't want to know." Mitch's stomach churned. The void around him pulsed, shifting slightly, like something was waiting. He forced himself to breathe. There had to be a way out. Something he hadn't tried before. Mitch turned sharply to the older version of himself, his jaw tight. "Tell me how to end it." The older Mitch just watched him, his expression unreadable. "You really think you're the first one to ask that?" Mitch stiffened. His blood ran cold. No, that wasn't possible. If he had asked before, that meant... The older Mitch stepped closer. His voice was barely a whisper. "You've tried to escape. 1,000 times. And you always come back." Mitch's vision blurred. The truth was a weight he wasn't ready for. A cycle that never ended. A curse he had chosen. His body shook. His mind screamed at him to deny it, to fight it, but the proof was right there. Staring back at him, Mitch's hands curled into fists. "I don't believe that." The older version of himself sighed. "You will." The world lurched. Mitch's body was yanked backward, pulled by some invisible force, something powerful and absolute. The void around him collapsed. The sound of an engine roared back to life. The wind slammed into him. The sky stretched overhead. The road was beneath his wheels again. The others were beside him, still riding, still grinning, like nothing had ever happened, like he had never left. Mitch's chest ached. His mind reeled. The truth sat there, festering in his skull. And yet, the moment he opened his mouth, to scream, to fight, to tell them, it was gone, like a dream fading at dawn. Mitch's grip tightened on the handlebars. The road stretched ahead. The wind howled. He smiled. And they kept riding. Because that's what they always did. That's what they'd always do. Forever.